The Abstractionism art movement began in the early years of the 20th century and lasted roughly until the World War II era. Key artists in this movement include Vasily Kandinsky, Piet Mondrian, Kazimir Malevich, and Georgia O'Keeffe. Kandinsky and Malevich were most popular during the early teen years and into the 20s of the new century, while Mondrian and O'Keeffe came shortly afterwards in popularity. Abstractionism was preceded by movements such as Cubism, Futurism, and Impressionism, and eventually gave way to pop art. While many abstractionist artists have different styles and paint for different reasons, I was able to collect these common core ideas that seemed fairly consistent throughout abstractionism. Regarding the subjects of abstract art, there really isn't much thought required to figure it out. This is simply because abstractionists did not paint about anything that happened or occurred in reality and rejected the idea of symbolism in their paintings. Most pieces feature designs that the artist simply thought would look cool. This does not mean, however, that the paintings are meaningless. As Taylor will later describe, Georgia O'Keeffe poured emotion and passion into her paintings, as did Vasily Kandinsky with his improvisations that he claimed were based on spiritual revelations and visions that he received. Another common subject came from the influence of theosophy. As a short overview, theosophy is an ideology that concerns itself with where we came from and where we are going as a species. It states that the universe began as atoms and an unknown force drove them together to create the universe that we know today. Seems somewhat like a reasonable belief, as probably most of us would agree so far. It gets a little stranger, though. Theosophists also believed that in order for the human race to reach its highest potential, the apocalypse must occur and society must begin anew, and that people must look inside themselves to unlock their inner spirituality in order to escape the fourth dimension. The connection from theosophy to art came from the man whose name you see now, Rudolf Steiner. He claimed that art had a vibrating spiritual property that could help awaken a person's dormant spirituality. Abstractionists, namely Kandinsky, Mondrian, and Malevich, bought into this and made many paintings to promote this idea. The techniques column may seem very vague and somewhat contradictory, but this is because the artists each had different unique styles and would oftentimes change their own styles. Here you can see the blatant use of geometric forms, the use of depth in multiple planes, and scaled versions of the same motif. Now we see the chaos of Kandinsky and the order of Mondrian. Messy imprecise brushstrokes, to nice soft ones, to extremely meticulous strokes. The techniques of abstractionism vary greatly, which is part of what makes it so exciting. World War I had a very profound impact on the abstract artists. This is most easily seen in the two that were most prevalent during this time, Kandinsky and Malevich. World War I was a big influence on Malevich's creation of suprematism, his own branch of abstractionism. One of his purposes of suprematism was to point people away from the corruption of war by using his paintings as a quote-unquote vessel to the crossroads of celestial paths to allow people to a quote-unquote cerebral passage to the fourth dimension. As for Kandinsky, he never would have returned to Moscow from Munich had the war not broken out. His most famous painting, Composition 8, which you saw on our title screen, never would have been painted. And now, let's introduce you to the artists.
Vasily Kandinsky was born in 1866 in Moscow, Russia. While he originally studied to be a lawyer and economist at the University of Moscow, he later turned his attention to art and moved to Munich at the age of 30 to study art. Today, he is considered the founder of the abstract art movement. A notable influence for Kandinsky came in the form of Monet's Haystacks at Giverny at an exhibit not more than a year before leaving for Munich. Upon seeing the painting, Kandinsky could not identify the subject. He even said that the artist had no right to paint in such a vague fashion. Nevertheless, Kandinsky was fascinated by this concept, and it would later become an integral part of his painting style.
This painting is titled Der blaue Reiter, or in English, The Blue Rider. It was created in 1903 after Kandinsky moved from Moscow to Munich. It in itself isn't so much abstract as it is a homage to where he obtained his artistic roots, Claude Monet and the Impressionists. Impressionist styles and techniques can be seen in the Blue Rider. Notice the brushstrokes that look so very similar to the style of Monet and the other Impressionist paintings we have seen in class. The not so out of the ordinary setting and subject are typical of Impressionism as well. Kandinsky, however, was sure to put his own touch onto one of his early paintings. If you look closely, you can see that the rider of the horse is holding something. Or are they? Scholars and viewers alike have debated whether or not the dark blue smudge in front of the rider is something or nothing. Some say that the rider is carrying an infant, which may very well lead to a deeper meaning behind the painting. Others believe that it is simply a darker shading of blue to show the shadow of the rider. Kandinsky loved leaving open ends in his painting that allowed each viewer to create their own story behind the piece. He called this technique Gesamtkunstwerk, or in English, total work of art. Kandinsky tried to involve viewers in his art on a personal level and believed that the art was truly completed with patron interaction. This painting is called Der Blaue Berg, or in English, the Blue Mountain, and was painted in 1909. One of the first things that stands out in the painting, besides the large mountain in the background that has a shade of blue that is inappropriately dark, are the horses and their riders. At this point, Kandinsky had painted multiple paintings that featured horses, and they began to become a symbol of his crusade against traditional aesthetic values. This would later become even more evident in the founding of his art group/almanac entitled Der Blaue Reiter. Moving on to the style of the piece, it is clear that Kandinsky not only drew artistic inspiration from Monet and the Impressionists, but also from the Fauves, as seen in the use of bright, vivid colors in the leaves of the trees, as well as in the shade of blue of the Blue Mountain, the painting's namesake. Der Blaue Reiter was not only a painting by Kandinsky, but also an association of Abstractionism artists featuring Kandinsky, Franz Marc, August Macke, Gabriele Münter, and a few others. The name of the group was selected by Kandinsky and Marc, both of whom loved featuring animals and vivid colors in their paintings. In 1912, a German writer wrote an almanac about the group titled Der Blaue Reiter Almanac that was overseen by Kandinsky and Marc, the two leaders of the group. In the almanac were essays written by artists talking about their opinions and views on the fine arts. Kandinsky and Marc also contributed essays to the almanac that explained to the general public that they weren't just crazy, and the meanings and forms of expression behind their artwork. Kandinsky wrote, "None of us seek to reproduce nature directly. We are seeking to give artistic form to inner nature or spirituality." Der Blaue Reiter Almanac was later considered to be the most significant collection of writings about art in the 20th century. Unfortunately, the group was dispersed at the outbreak of World War I when Kandinsky was forced to move back to Russia by the German government, and Marc was killed in battle. Kandinsky had a great love for both color and music. He even claimed to hear music in his head when he saw color, and that different colors would make different sounds to him. When talking about one, he would often make a reference to the other. He was even quoted saying, "Color is the keyboard, the eyes are the harmonies, the soul is the piano with many strings. The artist is the hand that plays, touching one key or another to cause vibrations in the soul." Music's influence on Kandinsky is even evident in the titles of his paintings. Pieces dubbed with the title of composition were extensively prepared for, and several drafts were made before the final work of art. Improvisations were often created in the spur of the moment after a spiritual event or influence, and impressions were, as the name would suggest, direct impressions left on him by reality, or in his vocabulary, external nature. While it may be difficult to decipher this piece that quite frankly has no connection to anything in reality and is purely a play on colors and forms, Kandinsky's Composition 7 is considered the pinnacle of his pre-World War I and Russian Revolution works. Kandinsky made over 30 sketches and watercolor paintings in preparation for Composition 7. The main motif of this painting is the quote-unquote oval intersected by the quote-unquote rectangle at the right side of this piece. I'm telling you this because, frankly, good luck figuring that out on your own. The oval plays the part of a hurricane that is tossing around colors and incoherent forms. Scholars speculate that Kandinsky made allusions to Judgment Day and the resurrection in Composition 7. While it may be impossible to truly decipher this painting, that's probably a pretty good guess considering Kandinsky's paintings commonly feature topics relating to his theosophical influences. Kandinsky did not paint much during the political unrest that plagued Russia for nearly a decade. When he did come back to painting, however, he seemingly picked up right where he left off with Composition 8, which is considered to be the high point of his post-war works and is one of his most recognizable paintings. During the 10-year span between Composition 7 and Composition 8, Kandinsky picked up a few new styles and techniques, mostly from Kazimir Malevich and the Russian suprematists and constructionists. This is evident in the contrast between Compositions 7 and 8, mostly noted in the colorful chaos of 7, to the stability of geometric forms and geometric interactions in 8. Specifically notice the precise angles and lines and the overlapping figures and forms that give the painting a sense of depth.
Piet Mondrian is most widely known for his composition paintings and other abstract works he created during his career. While some of these abstract works may look meaningless to critics, Mondrian actually tried to paint the world in its simplest form. This means taking what we really see and reducing it down to its basic structure. The emotion of beauty is always obscured by the appearance of the object. Therefore, the object must be eliminated from the picture. This quote by Mondrian summarizes why it is not necessary to have a subject in a painting. Piet's artwork was not always so abstract. In fact, he attended art school and received a certificate to teach art before his career began. This was because Piet's parents did not like his choice of a career as an artist, because they believed it was too risky and wanted him to be able to have a backup plan. This background in art school caused Mondrian's paintings to reflect some elements he was taught and not his own views of the world. For example, Mondrian painted many landscapes and still life from everyday life. These paintings were realistic and the subject was identifiable at the time. During this stage of his career, Mondrian focused more on nature and scenery and replaced people, buildings, or other objects in his paintings, but they would be small and generally incorporated into the background. The horizon seemed to be important to Mondrian, and in many landscapes would be very close to or directly in the middle of the canvas. Mondrian also commonly used color to express mood. For example, the lighting and shading used in the clouds can show happiness or gloom. Mondrian's use of color changed over the next few years, and around 1907, Mondrian's paintings showed his perception of the world, and not necessarily the reality everyone else saw. Some believe the Fauves, who were well known for creating art with the bright, vibrant colors, influenced Mondrian's work during this era. A specific brushstroke Mondrian began to experiment with in this stage was the technique of pointillism. Pointillism is a skill involving painting a picture using tiny dots placed very closely together. The horizontal horizon was commonly used by Mondrian in this phase also. Mondrian changed this orientation from horizontal to vertical in his next stage. His paintings became taller, as if you were looking up from a worm's eye, and gradually the background was omitted from the scene, leaving only one focus. This focus tended to be a windmill, lighthouse, or church. It seems that Mondrian left out a background because he did not see the importance of nature and was trying to break away from the reality that nature is. These paintings also showed contrast in them, whether it be in the shift from horizontal to vertical subjects or the contrast of colors used. Mondrian was always changing things up. All of this contrast was balanced out by Mondrian eventually. In his next period, Mondrian focused on balance as the most important thing in the painting. This balance can be shown in a collection of paintings of trees. These trees exhibited both horizontal and vertical lines. These two opposites balance each other out. Mondrian's attempt to reach equilibrium starts in motion, a quest for balance that leads him to a more abstract interpretation of the world. Mondrian's abstract paintings seem to be influenced by Cubism at the beginning. While Mondrian continues to paint trees, they become more difficult to identify. These paintings are also divided into many sections because of the branches on the tree, and are more defined than before. The tree is also much more condensed into the center of the canvas, and soon the painting seems to lose the subject altogether. This moves Mondrian into a short phase where his paintings are enclosed or condensed into an oval shape. These paintings are all similar in that they contain what appears to be a random arrangement of mostly varying in size rectangles and squares. Many of these paintings show some depth and can appear to be 3D if you look at the focus, even though they are flat in reality. Paintings like these that did not contain squares and or rectangles consisted of short horizontal and vertical lines and dashes. The layout of these paintings soon led to Mondrian's most well-known series of paintings, his compositions as he named them. Mondrian's composition paintings were a result of him moving to Paris, the art capital of the world, around 1911. Mondrian visited a friend in the Netherlands a few years later, in 1914, and was unable to return to Paris until 1919 because of the outbreak of World War I. While Mondrian was trapped in the Netherlands, he learned of an artist, Van der Leck, who used only primary colors in his paintings. This inspired Mondrian to co-found and joined the Distill movement. Distill translates to the style and was a Dutch art movement with a focus on creating harmony through art. While a part of Distill, Mondrian learned the methods of neoplastism. Neoplastism was a technique of creating art using only the primary colors of red, blue, and yellow, along with white, gray, and black. The art made using the style was very clean and contained straight black lines and right angles only. A lot of times Mondrian would only enclose two sides of a square in one of these paintings to allow for growth and continuation beyond the canvas. Mondrian received a lot of criticism for his composition paintings because they were all very similar and only had subtle differences. Because of this, people doubted the fineness of his work and questioned how much creativity Piet really had if he just painted basically the same thing over and over. While many of Mondrian's later paintings may look the same to an untrained eye, there was a lot of thought that went into every aspect of his paintings, including the thickness and placement of every single line. Also, even though it may have looked as if Mondrian was just painting geometric shapes, he was painting the world as he saw it, in its simplest form. Mondrian described his work as always further, meaning not only did he want to advance his art for as long as he lived, but also that he would continue with what he was so dedicated to, no matter what others thought, because some people would never understand it. In order to continue his art the way he wanted to, Mondrian moved from Paris to London in 1938 to escape the growing fascist movement going on in Paris. It did not take Piet long to become bored with London, and only 2 years later, in 1940, he decided to move to New York. The busy city life of the Big Apple inspired Mondrian in more ways than one. First, the nonstop city encouraged, and maybe even forced, Mondrian to work more quickly in order to keep up with everyone else. Mondrian used new techniques such as taping out sections of the canvas to be able to fill them with color faster and easier, as opposed to the traditional way of freehanding everything precisely. Second, the way that people moved throughout the city inspired Mondrian's last two paintings, one of which is the Broadway Boogie Woogie. This painting was a little different from his previous compositions because none of the many squares were enclosed, which represented some sort of freedom. The yellow lines are roads, and the many red, blue, and white small squares represent people or cars scurrying about the city. The larger squares and rectangles probably signify buildings. This painting is from an aerial view and provides a different perspective than normal for Mondrian. The second of the two paintings is the Victory Boogie Woogie, which was Mondrian's last and unfinished painting. Mondrian was a very dedicated artist and died in 1944 of pneumonia, with not much besides his paintings and art supplies left.
Kazimir Severinovich Malevich was born in Kiev in 1878, which was then considered to be part of the Russian Empire. Malevich dabbled in art as a kid, and he studied drawing in Kiev in 1895 and 1896, but oftentimes he would not be able to see the deeper meanings in paintings or understand symbolism. This would prove to be instrumental in the development of his own branch of abstractionism that he called suprematism. After his father's death in 1904, Malevich moved to Moscow to study art at the Moscow School of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture for the next 6 years. Today, Kazimir Malevich is credited in being the pioneer of geometric abstractionism and the founder of Russian avant-garde suprematism. Before Malevich founded suprematism, he considered himself a cubo-futurist. As the name would suggest, he liked to combine the time and fourth dimension related themes of cubism with futurist subjects such as technology and speed, which can be seen here in Malevich's knife grinder. His futurist roots came from peers Natalia Goncharova and Mikhail Larionov, whom he had met at the Moscow School of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture. The two had a mutual interest in Italian futurism and created two groups titled Jack of Diamonds and Donkey's Tail, in which Malevich participated in and drew inspiration from. As for his Cubist background, Malevich was not the only artist in Moscow that had an appreciation for Cubism. In fact, Cubism was very common in the capital of the Russian Empire in the early teen years of the century. The man that can be thanked for this Cubist fad is Aristarch Lentilov. He studied Cubism in Paris, France in 1910 and 1911, and upon his return to Moscow in early 1913, the Western style became an instant hit and worked its way into the paintings of many of Russia's influential artists at the time, including Kazimir Malevich in this painting titled Peasant Woman with Buckets. Victory Over the Sun was a theatrical performance put on by Soyuz Molodyozy, or in English, Union of Youth, in 1913. This play was unique because it was performed solely in the language of Zaum. Zaum was an experimental language developed by Russian avant-garde artists Velimir Klebnikov and Alexei Krushenik. The word Zaum literally translates from Russian as beyond the mind or beyond sense. The language itself made no coherent sense even to the users of the language, and was used solely for art and poetry because it was simply a string or collection of sounds that the speaker thought would sound cool together. This idea would factor largely into pushing Malevich towards suprematism. The play itself, Victory Over the Sun, was intended to demonstrate the artistic similarities between text, paintings, and music. Of course, the audience had no idea what their performers were saying, and reacted in an overall negative and even violent manner in some cases. Malevich has now arrived at abstraction, and drifts ever closer to suprematism with this painting, titled Cow and Violin. Try as I might, I still can't seem to understand where he gets this name from. It's like it's right there, Anyway, I digress. Malevich uses a number of the principles of Zaum in this painting. One being that there is no meaning to there being a cow or a violin. He just thought it would make a cool painting, and I'd have to agree with him. I'd love to have this hanging in my living room. I digress again. Zaumists wanted their art to be rid of logic, symmetry, and symbolism to the real world, and that's exactly what Malevich achieved here. From Cubism and Futurism to Suprematism was a short 10-page writing by Kazimir Malevich that explained, as the title would suggest, his transition from his Cubo-Futurist style of painting to his newly founded Suprematism. The writing itself is actually quite pompous and pretentious, unlike Kandinsky's Blue Rider Almanac. The main theme throughout the text is Malevich criticizing and insulting artists and art movements that involve replicating nature or reality. He dismisses them as uncreative and unoriginal and compares them to savages. One of Malevich's opening statements reads, "I have transformed myself in the zero of form and dragged myself out of the rubbish-filled pool of academic art." The text continues with the bashing of artists for a number of pages until he reaches the point where he begins to talk about suprematism. He complains that his supremist forms are proof of how everything began from nothing, which goes along with the theosophical influences of many abstractionism artists. I probably would not be too far off with my assumption that Malevich named his style suprematism because he believes it to be the most superior form of art. You've heard me talk about and hint at suprematism for a while now, and I think it's time to see just what it is that Malevich praises so heavily. Without further ado, I give you suprematism. Yup, this is it. This black square is the embodiment of suprematism. No joke. And I know what you're asking. Well, based off of all of his ranting about the inferiority of all other art, there must be some super secret epic meaning behind the simple black square, right? And to that, I would answer with a resounding no. There is no meaning, there is no secret, it is simply a square. And that is the reason why I had so much fun researching Kazimir Malevich and putting together this part of the presentation. Remember how I said that Malevich never understood symbolism as a kid? Well, it all stems from there. Malevich essentially said to the world, art doesn't have to mean anything or represent anything, and it shouldn't. In fact, here's a black square. No, it doesn't mean anything or represent anything. It's a freaking square. Deal with it. You can imagine the outrage from the art community. Many artists and viewers dismissed suprematism as garbage and an insult to art. The Soviet Union even eventually went so far as to ban Malevich's suprematist paintings and forbid him from painting similar ones. In response, Malevich left Moscow for Poland and Germany, and suprematism lived on. Does this remind you of anything? It should. Though it might not be the infamous black square, it follows the same concept of Malevich's suprematism, but the fact that he changed his subject from a square to a circle didn't help improve his reputation amongst his critics. Yep, another square, except this one's red. Apparently there was room for the color red in Malevich's new artistic order. Although not that much more, this painting looks a little more complex than the red square. And this one looks more complex than the painting previous it. Are you beginning to see a pattern? What Malevich's running theme with suprematism was to show how he believed everything came into existence and how everything will come into existence again once everything we know is gone. It begins with the simplest of geometric forms, and they build upon each other and build upon each other until they become complex pieces of work. This is consistent with the theosophical beliefs that influenced many abstractionists.
Georgia O'Keeffe was an abstractionist artist who grew up in the early 20th century. She was a popular artist then, and is still an influence on art today. Throughout her years, she produced many artworks with key characteristics, recognizable methods, changes over time, and was an influence in many ways. Many characteristics in her artwork included illuminated detail, conceptualism, and were non-figurative and meaningful. This artist aimed to break barriers of materialism and modernity because there was dissatisfaction in the time with materials. Her goal was to draw inner emotions and create connections for the observer. She had conceptual and non-figurative works. Her artworks did not represent a being, place, or thing, and had eliminated details from recognizable objects. She used relationships of forms and colors, and had a comprehensive art. She used her art as an expressive language and had views that everything in the universe had equal and high meaning. There are many things you would recognize in her artworks. Many of her works have linear designs, non-literal designs, encourage viewer participation, and often seems vague. All of her artworks seemed vague, but dominated the intellectual world. She expressed her deepest feelings and had goals of harmony. Her artwork had linear and distinct lines, encouraged viewers to think more, participate more, develop ideas, and had goals to set a mood. Her artwork always seemed to seek something and removed any dependence on real-world objects and excluded outside forces. Many of her works were reflections and interests in theories, while she only depicted certain objects, instead of relying on details. Some of her artwork were juxtapositions, and she had very specific placement of lines. Many changes in art started happening. As Georgia O'Keeffe started to rise, her art was a rethinking of art. Initially thought of radical, was first looked down upon, and was a symbol of new art. Her art was a new approach to interpretation, used reduction of basic geometric designs, and was a symbol of new thinking. Her work was unparalleled to average and was composed of non-representational framework, sometimes reflecting philosophy or advances in science. Her work was best compared to poetry or literature, and all objects on her canvas played an equal role. Her work was a rethinking of current art and addressed issues in non-direct ways. At first, it started with bold and graphic punches and sensual work and thought of as radical. This artist was influenced in many ways. There were advances in math and science, philosophy and technology. She had views on equality, social realism, and cubism. While her work was first looked down upon, it coincided with advances in science, technology, and changes in urban life. Her peers of cubism thought of her art as radical, as she adhered and connected it to social realism. She was also driven by social equality, as she was a woman of the time and not as equal as men. An obstacle she faced was that she did not agree on concepts of God and science. This was an example of social realism as the world started to develop. Many of her works that expressed her feelings had to do with World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and being a woman. Through all of this, she proved herself to be an independent thinker and had mental toughness. In her early career, she studied anatomical drawing and was slightly influenced by Cubism. Many misunderstandings of her work were due to a different perspective and were not the same as she had viewed. As the world started to develop, she expressed her feelings through this abstract art. As abstractionism developed as a comprehensive art, so did math and science, which was proof that the world was moving into intellectual processes. While it is not as common, we still see this art sometimes today. We even have one of Georgia O'Keeffe's pieces in our hallways, and she has a museum dedicated to her work. As abstractionism started to go down, pop art started to rise. Abstractionism was a gateway to pop art as it challenged art by including imagery and popular culture. It was a return of representational art and had a powerful influence on American culture. Abstractionism was challenged because it was more common to Americans. It was less personal than abstractionism, and it was shifted to modernism. Abstractionism eventually became less popular because pop art was more into popular culture and everyday life. There was a blur of boundaries, and it was not as conceptual as abstractionism.